All right, continuing on with World War II notes, we'll keep focusing on the war at home to start with. Industrial strength, industrial prosperity. One of the keys to the Allies winning the war was the amazing and massive production boom the U.S. created. Um, the U.S. was the biggest armament supplier for all the Allies. That would be the British and the Russians mostly, but also the Chinese, to some extent the French. But we produced so much stuff at home. We helped win the war with just our amazing ability to build, whether it was airplanes, tanks, ships, and just send food and everything. If you look at the bottom of the slide, it talks about how many airplanes Roosevelt insisted the U.S. build, how many tanks, anti-aircraft guns, and 16 million tons of merchant shipping as well. It's just a massive amount. The buildup in our economy was entirely switched to wartime production. And I think that's something else that we haven't seen for a long time, that our economy completely switches because the federal government tells us to. We talked about that earlier with Ford and Chevy, but it was lots of other aspects of American life were completely ran by the government. And something that I haven't seen anything like that in my lifetime until now. With the coronavirus, the way the government is running things, it actually reminds me of the way government ran things in World War II. They were involved in every aspect of American lives. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The war ended the Great Depression. Factories would be run 24/7. By the end of the war, $320 billion pumped into the economy. That will get any economy out of a depression. Another thing I want to talk a lot about, wartime rationing. It limited some goods. People needed to ration stamps to purchase their monthly allotment of whether it was meat, coffee, tires, gas. New cars weren't available. We talked about they weren't making cars. Housing was scarce. And this reminds me of the coronavirus shutdown as well. With things that are shut down, the government telling us what can and can't be open. Here's just one example of inside a ration book. This one says gasoline, good for 4 gallons. This one says fuel oil, you can get 11 gallons. And it just tells you what ration board it is. And the next slide is an example of what a ration book would look like. Years ago, I used to have students interview somebody who lived through the Great Depression and World War II. And quite often, if they interviewed a grandma, one of the things they would remember is the ration books and how frugal they had to be in saving their sugar, or their dad saving tires and things like that. So that impacted everyday life. All right, back to the war on the ground in Europe. From 1943 to 1945, the U.S. became heavily involved in Europe. With the beginning, we fought in North Africa. And the first entrance into Europe would be in Italy. But to get to Germany, and the goal is for both the Russians and the Americans and the British, is to capture Berlin, force the Germans to surrender. Really tough to get there from Italy because in the northern part of Italy are the Alps. So not really a feasible way to get into Germany. For a long time, Stalin and Russia had wanted the Allies to open a second front. For much of the war, the Soviets were fighting the Germans alone in Europe on the Eastern Front. In the Western Front, nothing was really going on except for a lot of bombing by both sides, the German Luftwaffe and the air forces of the Americans and the British. So Stalin had pushed for the Americans to open a second front. This became known as Operation Overlord, and it occurred on June 6th, 1944, and forever known as D-Day. I'm going to go forward one slide, and then we'll come back a little bit. This is the map of the D-Day landings. There were 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. And by far the toughest beach was the American landing at Omaha. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, if you see any images of the destruction from D-Day, usually it's from Omaha Beach. The Americans coming in these Higgins boats, a lot of them were slaughtered, the first waves especially. But eventually, each of these beaches established what was known as a beachhead, and they were able to offload supplies and eventually land an army. In fact, they landed over 1 million men in a couple of months and began to push the Germans back. Okay, and D-Day was a lot of different activities all involved in one massive attack. You had airborne divisions landing behind enemy lines. the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, and you had the British and the Canadians and the Americans involved. So it was a massive undertaking on a scale never seen before in any war. But it allowed the Americans, the Allies, to push and march toward Berlin, which eventually they would get to, and the Russians would get there from the east. The Americans and British and French and Canadians would get there from the west. And then the Holocaust. I'll talk a little bit about the Holocaust. I think you guys study that quite a bit. But it is the murdering of over 6 million Jews, Poles, dissidents, communists, you name it. The Germans were very efficient in their methods of killing. And I have this Holocaust map up here because I want to point out they constructed camps specifically for the purpose of killing people. Treblinka was one, Auschwitz was another, Sobibor is another. And it's just gruesome reading about their ability to efficiently kill, bury, burn bodies. And once the Russians started overtaking these Polish camps, they started trying to hide the bodies and hide the fact of what they did. And the horrors of the Holocaust are, in all of humanity, the worst things I've ever read about. And there's stories all over, but the systematic killing of over 6 million people by another group of people is sobering, and hopefully never happens again. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We'll finish the notes in the next session.